Hello, I'm Deanna Cohen. I'm CEO and co-founder of Plastic Pollution Coalition. Thank you for joining us this month for this session, part of our global webinar series, which brings our community together to share and highlight the latest issues, information, and resources to help stop the plastic pollution crisis. Welcome to our April webinar, The Power of Service, Moving from Anxiety to Action for the Planet. Plastic Pollution Coalition is a nonprofit communications and advocacy organization that collaborates with an expansive global alliance of organizations, businesses, and individuals to create a more just, equitable, regenerative world free of plastic pollution and its toxic impacts. Before we get started, we would like to share a few tips. We've turned off the chat at this point, so we encourage you to submit questions in the Q&A function and to upvote your favorite questions. Please note, please make sure your Zoom is in speaker view at the top right corner of your Zoom window. If it's in attendee view, gallery view, or another format, you may not be able to see any presentations or slides. And finally, please feel free to tag the panelists on social media and tag us at Plastic Pollutes. So to get started, we have some poll questions we'd like to ask you as our audience to get a better idea for the panelist of who's joining us today. Let's start with poll question 1. Where are you joining us from? Please select 1. Well, I see that we're mainly coming from North America and Canada, but it looks like we have folks on the webinar today from Asia, from Australia, New Zealand or the Pacific Islands, from Central and South America, and from Europe. So welcome. Thank you for joining us. Let's go on to poll question number 2. What best describes the sector in which you work? Please choose 1. Great. Well, it looks like we have a really wonderful range of people coming from all different fields: corporate business, education and academia, government and policy, the media, from the nonprofit sector, from research, and a lot of people from others. So thank you for joining. Poll question number 3. What actions do you personally take to reduce your plastic footprint? Please select all answers that apply. Very cool. We have a very action-oriented group attending the webinar today. Almost 100% of us bring reusable grocery bags. A lot of people are buying bulk and utilizing zero waste vendors, refill vendors. There's a lot of reusable drinking bottle commitment here, which is awesome. Seems like just such low-hanging fruit to me. Bringing your own containers for leftovers at restaurants, growing your own produce, and using refillable grocery services. Wonderful. So let's move on to poll question number 4. We have 5 of them today. Do you feel like you are personally and regularly affected by climate anxiety? Well, it looks like 87% of us do feel that we're personally and regularly affected by climate anxiety. So looking forward to learning more from our experts on this panel today. And we come to our last poll question number 5. What do you think are some ways to cope with climate anxiety? Please select all that apply. Well, I see that more than 50% of us are looking for ideas, so I hope that that'll be a great takeaway from today's conversation. But talking to friends and family about our anxiety and taking regular action to positively improve our environment. Yeah, I agree. And looking forward to learning more. So thank you for taking part in the poll questions. And all right, the topic for the webinar today is the power of service, moving from anxiety to action for the planet. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Heather White. Heather is an environmental lawyer, author, consultant, motivational speaker, and the CEO and co-founder of One Green Thing. She's the former president of Yellowstone Forever, the nonprofit partner to Yellowstone National Park. She's the executive director of She was the executive director of Environmental Working Group and she was the Director of Education Advocacy at the National Wildlife Federation. Heather also serves as counsel on the energy and environment to U.S. Senator Russell Feingold of Wisconsin. And additionally, Heather sits on the Executive Advisory Board for Plastic Pollution Coalition. I just had the pleasure of seeing Heather on the beginning of her book tour for her new book, One Green Thing, in Washington, D.C. And it's a great pleasure to see you now on the webinar. Welcome, Heather.
Deanna, thank you so much for getting us all together today. And for those of you who are joining your first PPC webinar, I want to encourage you to subscribe to this series. I think you're going to be so impressed with the quality of conversation and the topics that Plastic Pollution Coalition brings together pretty much on a monthly basis. So please stay tuned, follow them on social, and be sure to make time in your schedule for these conversations. I have the distinct honor of being on the advisory council to PPC, and I know it has enriched my experience and also helped me deal with eco-anxiety and really feel like I'm involved in the movement. I'm so thrilled to and excited to introduce our panel, which I'm going to do in just a minute. But before I do that, I just want to take a few minutes to tell you a little bit about my journey and how I got involved in studying and researching eco-anxiety. As Deanna kind of shared with you, I've been doing this work in environmental advocacy for more than 20 years, but it was really talking to my kids who are teenagers about climate action that brought me to write this book. And in 2019, my older daughter, Katie, who was a freshman in high school, wanted to participate in the Greta Thunberg-inspired climate strike. And I said to her, of course, Katie, you have my permission to go, but I noticed it was going to rain, and she had a really heavy backpack and a trumpet, like a lot of these high school students, carry a lot of stuff. And I said, you know what, why don't I pick you up and I'll drive you to the protest site, and that way you won't get rained on and you won't have to carry all this stuff. And I'll just say that did not go over very well in my household. First of all, it was a walkout, which completely defeated the purpose of having your parent there. And secondly, it was, driving her in a car when the whole point was to transition off of fossil fuels. And that was the point of the strike. And my daughter said to me, Mom, where is Gen X? Where are baby boomers? Where are millennials? What are you doing about the climate crisis? You can't leave it all on our shoulders. We're running out of time. So I realized two things. One, I needed to dig into the mental health impacts of the climate crisis and the anxiety that young people especially feel. And secondly, create an invitation for more people to see themselves in the climate movement. And I did that through this book, which is more of a self-help book for you to find your strengths in service and how you can get involved in the movement. So lots of journal prompts, a lot of exploration about how you can show up in the movement, and you don't have to do everything for everybody, but really to accelerate your skills and your unique talents in service to others. So with that, it is my great thrill to introduce Maya Penn. And Maya happens to be on the board of the nonprofit I started, One Green Thing. Maya is an activist, an artist, an animator, a three-time TED speaker, and she's 22 years old. So for those of you who have goals, I'll just do hashtag goals when it comes to Maya. Maya's also an author with Simon & Schuster. She's a sustainability consultant and has done advanced studies at Cambridge. She's just a wonderful talent. And with that, I'm going to introduce you to Maya. And Maya, if you could just tell us a little bit about what got you involved into the climate crisis and what got you involved, and specifically kind of digging into the concept of eco-anxiety.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Heather, for that amazing introduction. I'm so excited to, be always working with you and now being a part of the incredible work that the Plastic Pollution Coalition is doing to speak on such a crucial topic. I've been an environmental activist from the age of 8 years old. I'm 22 now, as you mentioned, so that gives me 14 years of doing work in environmental activism, in sustainability education, and utilizing, all the tools that I have, from consulting to animation and my own nonprofit, Maya's Ideas for the Planet, which focuses on humanitarian and environmental justice issues, really pushing the movement forward. I think that for me, eco-anxiety has always really been a topic that's been of interest to me. In 2017, it was recognized by the American Psychological Association. And it was really interesting to see something that I feel so many people in my generation, including myself, deal with, recognized on such a large scale and really reflected with, language that was tangible. Being a member of Gen Z, we have grown seeing firsthand the impact that the climate crisis has on our world. I'm someone who, is born and raised in Georgia. And so, we tend to already get really intense tornado seasons during the summer. And I've only just seen how that's increased and the weather patterns become more erratic and unpredictable as I've gotten older. And I think a lot of people can agree with that. And also we're one of the generations that grew up learning about things like global warming and climate change in school. So we kind of had this language to put two and two together. And then when you're seeing every year is the hottest year on record, and it's really tough when you feel like that world's on your shoulders. But I think the key is definitely intergenerational collaboration and intergenerational support, and really recognizing and lifting up those feelings, and as Heather spoken so eloquently about, translating that anxiety into action.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Maya. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Britt Wray. And Britt Wray is a human and planetary health postdoctoral fellow at the Stanford Center for Innovation in Global Health, the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment, and London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And her research focuses on the mental health impacts of climate change. She's also the creator of the newsletter Generation Dread. Gen Dread is the name. I highly recommend that you subscribe to that on Substack. It's all about staying sane in the climate crisis. And she's also the author of a new book that comes out May 3rd, Generation Dread, Finding Purpose in an Age of the Climate Crisis. And that's a book that investigates and takes a deep dive into the psychological underpinnings and impacts of the climate crisis. Welcome, Britt. We're thrilled to have you. And if you could just tell us a little bit about your journey and background and how you ended up studying this really important issue.
Thank you so much, Heather. And it's a real honor to be here with you and such an amazing young person like Maya, who's doing so much incredible change making around this issue. So first and foremost, gratitude for this. I would like to be very frank and honest about my experience coming into this field, now a researcher looking at the mental health impacts of the climate crisis. And it's because of my own very significant amount of distress about the climate crisis that I experienced in 2017. Interesting that that's the year that the American Psychological Association decided to recognize it as the chronic fear of environmental doom. I was certainly living with that feeling. And it was brought about specifically because my partner and I started talking about trying to get pregnant. And here I am working as a science communicator, ingesting all of the grim scientific evidence, observing the lack of sufficient action to really protect our home in the future for humanity and all our non-human kin, and feeling really the grief bubbling up and the anxiety and the pain, the intolerable feelings that come with reckoning with how tattered the state of the world is. And of course, there are synchronous crises. The climate crisis is only just one. But this became no longer an intellectual preoccupation of mine. Of course, I've cared about this forever. I've been to many climate marches before that. I studied conservation biology in university. I had pangs of eco-anxiety before. But when it became this huge dilemma around whether or not to reproduce myself, it was difficult not only because I felt deviant for even asking that question. I wasn't seeing it reflected in the wider culture around me. I felt quite alone in these feelings, and they weren't mirrored or validated by those I was chatting with. And it was quite surreal to notice that change very quickly after that period, essentially because of my own eco-anxiety and needing to find ways to cope with it and keep my eyes open to the crisis rather than look away out of some kind of self-preservation, enact self-denial or allow my cognitive defenses to, do the kind of head in the sand approach that we understand many people do. I decided to turn my science communicator brain on myself. I made a documentary, a radio documentary feature about this question of reproductive anxiety in the climate crisis. And then I saw, oh, this is just scratching the surface. Actually, there's a lot to be explored here about the wider psychological impacts of the climate and eco crisis on people, where reproductive anxiety is one tiny sliver of a whole emergent field around this distress, but also the acute trauma that occurs in climate hazard exposure, and what can be done to really band together and innovate to improve the mental health system, to be able to take on and deal with the scope of psychic damage that the climate crisis is already causing and set to cause. That research not only helped me find my own coping strategies and work towards external forms of action that have been really meaningful and healing for me, but as a result, created the book that comes out next week, Generation Dread, and also allowed me to quit my job and start a new focus in my career as a researcher in this area. So I think the personal is political in this space in a deeply entwined way. And the emotions are challenging many of us, millions of us around the world, to find out how we can explore them, feel them, and reinvest into meaningful efforts at this time that can help us create the better futures that we otherwise don't see coming unless we get to work.
Well, thank you so much, Britt, for your research. And I think you were part of this very important study that came out in September of 2021, September last year. It was a survey of 10,000 young people ages 16 through 25. And 1 out of 4 said they did not want to have children because they're so worried about the climate crisis. So This question that your personal question that you were asking with your partner, I think is front and foremost on a lot of young people's minds. So I'm just going to turn to Maya and ask Maya, you're giving talks around the country constantly, you're engaging with all generations, but I think a lot of young people look to you as a leader. They look to you for inspiration. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're hearing, what you're reading as you go across the country, either Zoom or in person, and are connecting with young people about the climate crisis?
Absolutely. I've always for years been speaking to youth at schools, universities, youth organizations here in the US and around the globe. And, I really feel young people especially, I know we see, the young people that are speaking out and speaking up about the climate crisis. But on the flip side of that, there are so many young people that also feel like they don't have the power to really make a difference, and will still factor their age in the same factor that's like, oh, we're this generation that we're rising up and hear our voice. You also have these people that feel like, well, I'm too young, I just don't have the resources, the money, the power, the experience, the whatever to make a difference. Like, what can I do? And as someone who has been in the environmentalism and sustainability space from a young age, I think that what's really crucial, and that I've personally learned in seeing how environmental issues overlap and intertwine with other social issues, I think it's really important to remember that it's the goal of many oppressive systems to make us feel like we don't have any power, like that we can't make a difference, and that our voices don't matter. And it's that thing of feeling hopeless, that I think that it's really crucial to keep that hope, because in many ways, that is an act of activism within itself. You're saying, I'm not going to accept the way that things are. I want to create a better future for myself and other generations. And so I think that's one thing. People feel like they're a drop in the bucket, but every drop creates a ripple effect, and it's really important to understand that innate power that you already have, one, and then two, I'm really also seeing, I feel like it's really overwhelming. A lot of the work that I do is in the education space, is really demystifying and humanizing these really multi-layered topics when it comes to the climate crisis and other environmental issues like environmental justice, and sustainability, even within various industries in the private sector. All of these different things that we see headlines about every day, I feel like there's just so much going on that a lot of times, other people or, my friends or peers just don't know how to compartmentalize it or internalize it in a way that's healthy and in a way that they know how they could get involved, because a lot of this is intentionally confusing at times, and a lot of it's, and there's so much overlapping. I'm like really there to break down and focus in on, hey, here's what's going on, and here's how all these things intertwine with each other. And there are literally countless, endless ways for everyone to take that step to get involved, to make their difference in whatever way that they see and whatever way they can use their own passions and skills and talents and platforms. So it's really, for me, about breaking these topics down, humanizing them, and making sure that people feel empowered, that their voices and actions do matter and can make a difference, to also create top-down change.
Absolutely, Maya. And there's so many things, so many threads that I want to pull out from what you just said. I'm going to ask Britt if you could just react to just a couple things that Maya pointed out. The one is the intentionality of, when we're in an oppressive system, of wanting you to feel hopeless and kind of dealing with, like, kind of having, I don't know what the right psychological term is, it cognitive dissonance? I'm not sure, but like, if you can step back and say, wait, what is the purpose here? And is there a way for that to be empowering, if you can acknowledge that there's an intention behind someone, oppressive systems wanting you to feel hopeless? And then if you could talk a little bit about the term eco-anxiety that was recently part of the Oxford English Dictionary, and maybe some of your key research. So if you could kind of like pick up on those themes. And then I promised for folks on the call, I promised we're going to get to hope, but I want us to make sure that we really clearly identify the problem first.
Absolutely. So to Maya's good point about systems creating a sense of powerlessness and what some people call ecophobia, the idea that the helplessness that you feel really entraps you in an immobilized place that you can't budge yourself out from. Well, there's been some interesting research about which emotions that are often associated with ecological distress are more motivating for disrupting those kinds of systems than others. And one study actually found that compared to what could be called eco-depression and eco-anxiety, that eco-anger is actually more motivating for getting people into a position of enacting agency, understanding, or being able to contain self-efficacy, which is the psychological term of believing that your actions can make a difference, and then moving into some form of mobilization and collective action with others. And we know that anger is very closely linked to rage in the face of injustice, right? It's like a mama bear's roar that comes out when the line between right and wrong has been crossed. And so that's a very productive emotion that many activists hold dear to them as a fuel within them to be able to get up out of bed despite the burnout that is so often associated with activist work, despite the tireless efforts and, of course, onslaught of difficult news. So there's something very healing and liberating that social justice activists know very well about, that is also very relevant for an environmentally focused type of justice work. Now, going to the term eco-anxiety, many experts argue that it isn't just anxiety. What we're talking about is some kind of umbrella distress. And there's different ways of looking at when it's convenient to call it eco-anxiety versus not, in order to simply be able to focus our attention on something, know what we're talking about. But actually there's mixed feelings. There's anxiety, there's fear, there's helplessness, hopelessness, dread, anger, terror, all kinds of different emotions that are co-occurring often when one is particularly distressed by what's going on with the climate crisis. And so our research team, at some of my colleagues and I last year, did this study that you mentioned. I'll go into some of our findings. So we were looking particularly at the burden of this type of distress in youth. We know that youth are a globally distributed, vulnerable population when it comes to the impairing impacts of this kind of distress in their life. And so we were looking at 16 to 25-year-olds in Australia, Brazil, Finland, France, India, Nigeria, Philippines, Portugal, the UK, and the US, 10,000 in total. And we were quite alarmed by what we found, even though we were expecting for the data to be arresting. 45% of those 10,000 youth said that climate change negatively affects their daily life and functioning. So just their ability to get through the day, do things like eat, concentrate, work, go to school, sleep, spend time in nature, play, or have fun. 75% feel that the future is frightening. More than 50% feel that humanity is doomed, which is a horrific statistic to let land in your heart, that they won't have access to the same opportunities their parents had, and that the things they most value in life will be destroyed. And importantly, it's not just that young people are feeling all this heaviness because the environment isn't doing well. Our findings also showed that this form of distress is significantly correlated with perceptions of being lied to by leaders and betrayed by governments, which pushes us into a space of understanding this is not a pathology, right? To have eco-anxiety, for instance. It's not that the problem sits with you as an individual, it's a symptom of a very sick society that is dysfunctional and in tatters and not protecting human well-being over profits as it should be. And so in this way, we can talk about institutional betrayal and moral injury and these kinds of constructs to help us think deeper into what's really going on when it comes to eco-anxiety and help us find some solutions when we really can address it at that level.
Such important work, Britt, and thank you for creating this space for young people to be heard. And I definitely, when you talk about these feelings of anger, of betrayal, and how eco-anger can really be a motivating force for a lot of people on the call who are involved in this movement, especially if you're talking about plastic pollution, there is a heck of a lot of anger. Like, anger isn't a problem. There's a lot of fatigue though, and exhaustion when we're thinking about the battle and the intersectionality of it. So I'd like to ask you, Maya. So one of the things we talk about is an intergenerational partnership. And in my book, I call it Think Beyond Your Age. And in my book, and in a lot of the talks I give, I actually start with the idea of, I tell a fun story about watching soap operas with my great grandma and how much fun I had thinking about that moment with her. And then I think about playing a fun video game with my daughter. And I talk about how these small moments that we have intergenerationally can be really important. And then I ask you, the reader, to think about someone in your past. And if you don't know a lot about your family history, it doesn't have to be an ancestor, it can be a historical figure who created opportunities for you. Because the reality is all of us are our ancestors' wildest dreams. We have more opportunity in the face with all this trauma that we're dealing with. We have more opportunity than any other generation has ever had in the history of the planet. I mean, it's just really an amazing time for us to be here right now, despite all of our challenges. And then I ask you to envision that it's 2050 and you're sitting down with a teenager that you're related to. And I ask you, what will they thank you for? What will they wish you had known? So what I would like to ask you, Maya, and then I'm going to pivot over to you, Britt, in just a minute. Maya, can you talk to us about this idea of intergenerational partnership? What is your advice to young activists about how to be heard, how to have the conversation with your grandparents, your great grandparents, elders who have, the money, the resources, the power to help us make significant change? What advice do you have or thoughts you have on that?
Yeah, well, first of all, the thing I want to zero in on, Heather, that you said that was really interesting is that, that question of, what, like thinking to the future in like 2050 and then having like a teenage, the teenager that you might be related to, that's your descendant in some way, and like, what would they thank you for? The thing that you're speaking to is building legacy, which when I talk about activism and youth activism, I think that's something that is really crucial, because I think we get really trapped in, the here and now, and that kind of, can muddle how we feel like we need to show up. We think about, there's so many youth activists that feel like, that they might be focused on more niche areas of environmental activism and sustainability, that are often overlooked but are just as crucial. But they might feel like, oh, well, I have to go with whatever the trending topic is, and it's like, no, like the communities that their voices aren't heard. Focus in on what is natural and genuine to you. That's just something I wanted to zero in on. Just really focusing on, again, like building legacy makes your activism that much more powerful. So I really love that you said that. As far as connecting in the intergenerational collaboration, I think it's crucial to, again, note, like what you said, that there are so many people that have paved the way for voices like mine to be heard. As someone who has grown up in Georgia, which has been the heart in many ways of much civil rights activism, and someone who understands how much of the civil rights movement has overlapped with sustainability, environmental justice, environmental activism, combating environmental racism, and topics around that area, and being able to meet and learn from Dr. Bernice King, who's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s daughter, and meeting the late Representative John Lewis. I mean, it's being able to speak with those people and hear their journey and insight. I think that it's so crucial for us to understand that this, at the end of the day, is a human issue. All environmental issues are human issues. And, everyone from every generation can relate to, things just not seeming right in their community, in the world, and then wanting things to be better, for their people. It's better to be different, to see something they want changed in the world. And I think taking it from that level, is something that's really crucial, because more than likely that thing that, your ancestor, might have been, passionate about or wanted to see different, even if they didn't really take any specific action on it at the time, there's some way it can intertwine or parallel the current feeling you have right now when it comes to how our world leaders and private sector and, and the people around us are handling the climate crisis and are handling environmental issues. So I think that's something really interesting. And then also too, it's really important on that note of it being a human issue. I think that people need to remember that feelings such as eco-anxiety and, all of the other umbrella of environmental, distress that Dr. Wray spoke to, is really important to recognize this is still a natural response. People feel, the first thing is accepting, understanding that this feeling is a reflection of our natural need to protect our home, to protect our community and what we care about, and it shouldn't feel weird or strange that you're having such a passionate reaction to what's going on, because climate is all encompassing. Environmental issues are all encompassing. They encompass everything and every topic and every issue that we care about. And so understanding that this is natural and that, you might need that additional help to really be able to translate those feelings in a healthy way is a really important first step that I also share with a lot of young people too, so they don't feel alone or strange.
I think that's so helpful, Maya, to talk about how this is a natural response. One of the things that I hear a lot, and Britt, I'm looking forward to hearing your reaction about this, is, well, Heather, of course your kids have eco-anxiety because they're your kids, you do this work and so does my husband. And the friends who say that, I ask, why don't you just take a couple minutes and ask your kids or young people that you love, just take a few minutes. And to a person, they have all had really remarkable conversations, because I feel like there are resources there about how to talk to kids about climate change, that one direction. But what I try to do in my book is provide some opportunity and invitation to listen to how young people are feeling and the fears that they have, but also have an intention to share kind of what Maya was saying. We have seen tremendous progress in 1987 Montreal Protocol, right? We had an ozone hole, but the world came together. We banned CFCs that were in, antiperspirants and refrigerants, and they were in hairsprays, for example. And we made that switch, and the ozone hole has repaired. There are some good models for progress to have hope. Can you tell us, Britt, and this is probably a whole nother webinar, how to listen, How do we create space and listen and hold space for these young people?
Well, I'm really glad that you're taking that approach in your book. It is vital right now. Many people may assume that the young people in their lives do not have feelings about this because they're not enunciating themselves, to be eco-anxious of their own volition, but they most likely are. I would honestly put a bet on it in terms of just how pervasive these feelings are. And the reason why we don't necessarily know is that we're dealing with disenfranchised feelings. So emotions that get disregarded, we have no social norms around how to discuss them at the water cooler at work, around the dinner table with your friends and family. If they're not being named, we are not showing that they matter to us, right? And we are now in this moment of mass awakening. Many people have been feeling grief and anxiety about environmental disruption for a very long time, especially frontline communities, the most disadvantaged, that had the least to do with creating this crisis, often poor communities of color. Maybe they don't call it eco-anxiety, right? And it's intersecting with other forms of challenge, which is another conversation we can get into, the debate around eco-anxiety being a privileged phenomenon. I saw someone raise it in the chat. I think we can go there after. However, when it comes to these disenfranchised feelings, we need to create systems by which we can put ourselves out there and find a validating place in which we know we're not going to be shamed or judged for talking about these feelings. And there isn't going to be someone on the receiving end saying, don't be so dire, you're fine, you're just being dramatic, or these are just catastrophic thoughts. Let's look at how we can dismiss them. That ends up leaving people, of course, many times worse, because this is, as Maya rightly said, a healthy, normal, natural response that we have evolved, right, in the face of a threat, to pay attention to things that we care about and need to protect. And so listening by asking is really critical, because we can't assume that people will just come forth with these emotions when there's a lot of shame around them still. There's a lot of fear of being told to simply buck up, right? And I'll tell you, as someone who talks about these issues publicly a lot, it is vicious out there, right? I mean, people will absolutely attack you, and you can raise their defenses by talking openly about these kinds of fears. So certainly it's a tricky terrain, but one thing we can do is try and become very compassionate in the way that we attune to others and discuss these problems, because they're very scary for all of us. The climate crisis can become so severe in one's awareness that it makes them feel like the world is ending, right? It's not to say that the world is ending, but the feeling is of that caliber, and it can become terrifying. And, mortality salience, it brings about the awareness of death. I mean, that really changes a person's behavior. And so we need to be aware of that, practice emotional intelligence, and be able to slow right down and be very caring with one another and explore what might be true for the other person, and create these safe, containing settings in which we can have conversations, including young people in our lives who may be bottling a lot up that we're not yet aware of.
Oh, I love that, Britt. Thank you for that. And this idea of centering compassion in our conversations. And one of the chapters I say in my book is called No, You Can't Go It Alone: The Importance of Community and Establishing Community and Safe Places for Young People to be Heard. So I'm going to ask you one more question before we open it up for questions for the audience. And we've gotten some great ones already. We've got about 15 more minutes of the panel. But my question really deals with this idea of hope. I think we've done a good job of saying eco-anxiety is real and young people are feeling it. All of us are feeling it. 87% of the people on this call are feeling it. And when we talk about plastics, we know plastic is oil. It's made from oil. And we know that it's completely interlinked with the climate crisis. So if you're focused on Plastic Pollution Coalition, you're focused on the climate crisis. We've talked about the intersectionality of all of these issues. Talk to us about hope. So Maya, what gives you hope?
I think what gives me hope is the fact that despite this climate crisis that's driven by human activity, being something that our world has never faced before on this scale, we are also bringing forth so many incredible solutions that have also never been seen before at this scale. So many incredible grassroots work is being done by activists, by educators, by lawyers and legislators and in scientists and technologists and water protectors and land protectors. I mean, the thing is that's my biggest piece of advice that I give to anyone who is dealing with these feelings of eco-anxiety is to remember the fact that there are still solutions and work and, you know, and wins that are happening every day. They may not be the top headline, you know, they may not be what your mind zeroes in on. It almost makes you think of the compliments versus, you know, the thing of, you know, we can get 10 compliments, but if you have that one negative criticism, it just outweighs all of that. It's almost the same thing. And so when we, you know, really focus in, do more research on the work that's already being done and see how you can uplift that, support it, shout it out. I think that's really crucial to understanding that, you know, there's a balance between everything that's happening. So that's what gives me hope.
That's wonderful. Just all of the creativity that's out there and all the good news that's out there that we may not be able to it may not come to the surface in our news feed, but it's there and we are making progress. Britt, tell us your thoughts about hope.
Hope is a very tricky concept. It means different things to different people. I really like the interpretation of radical hope, which is finding ways to do things in the present moment for the present moment rightness of it without expectation of an outcome, right? Letting go of clinging to the outcome of our efforts, because this is very non-intuitive to activists who are action-oriented. Let me tell you, of course, I understand this personally, but being so attached to outcome can lead to burnout when we don't see that outcome manifesting. And we need to find ways of being resilient internally to be able to travel to the far side of grief and still take action anyway, right? And to be driven by a deep sense of love for this earth and everyone near and dear to us, and beautiful creatures that have evolved over millions of years that deserve to be protected, etc. Right? And so I think the climate crisis is a huge spiritual crisis of connection, and we need to be able to do that work on that level, and tapping into that kind of existential valve that we have within ourselves when we manifest the moral clarity around this. It allows us to keep going. And I find that really hopeful, that we can survive so much devastation, and humanity has, for so many cultural groups throughout time, the world has been ending over and over as civilizations have collapsed and rebirthed, right? And so many communities live on the edge of existential threat in the here and now. And yet there are ways of celebrating joy amidst the tragedy and continuing on and rebuilding and moving forth for better futures. So, the fact, when I look at history, when I look at other existential crises that humanity has faced, when I look at the oppressiveness of how hard things are for so many marginalized community, and yet there's so much culture and joy and everything along those lines, I find it incredibly resilience bearing, and it allows to focus in on the work in community, and that community saves, and finding your people to connect with and move forward on this work with is the most hopeful thing. And it's really difficult when we sit in these feelings alone, but when they become navigational tools, it's not like, oh, you're just eco-anxious and feeling bad all the time. You actually use them to point out what really matters, what you want to devote your energy and efforts around, and then find ways of tackling that. Then it's super hopeful.
Yes, 1,000 times yes, Britt and Maya. And when you're talking about a spiritual crisis of connection, I think that's so powerful when we think about where we are politically right now and what we need to do to be able to create that regenerative, positive future that we have all the technology for. So I'd say what I think gives me hope is the fact that we have all the technology. What's missing is the political will. And with that, I kind of want to dive into some of the questions that we've received. And one of the questions is, okay, what do we do? And what I will say, and I think it's really important because, of course, I live with teenagers who like to give me a hard time about individual action, because, of course, we need systemic change. We need huge policy market solutions. And so for them, Mom, seriously, this is, even though they know I'm on the Plastic Pollution Coalition, seriously, Mom, skipping the straw, like, what is that actually doing? And I've had to have pretty intense conversations around the dinner table and say, okay, well, if you're 14 and 16 from Bozeman, Montana, what are you going to be doing? Right? Like skipping the straw and that individual action is very important. And the reason it's important is not because of our carbon footprint. And that whole concept of the individual carbon footprint was actually BP promoted this through their marketing department to try to shift the burden onto consumers for plastic pollution and for the climate crisis, when in fact we know we didn't cause it, but we are part of the solution and part of the problem, of course. But individual action, in my view, and I think this is why I like, thinking about what car you buy, thinking about, offsetting your travel costs, which is what I'm doing for my book tour, skipping the straw, refusing single-use plastic. It is an important driver of culture change. And I think the culture change aspect is where we've kind of somehow like missed the conversation, because we get so focused, because many of us in the environmental community are, one of the profiles I have in my book is called the wonk. We immediately go to the wonk and start counting the carbon, which of course we need to do for these big solutions. But for most of us, what we need to be doing is thinking about our actions. So this idea of taking the intentionality of an action every day, one green thing, in order to shift that culture, I think is a very important driver. So the question is like, what do we do? I would say with respect to your feelings, and Britt and Maya may have a different idea, this idea of this daily practice of sustainability is really important. I also encourage you to journal. I think that could be a one green thing. Spending time in nature, the thing we're trying to protect, is really important. And I want to remind everybody, like I remind my kids, the refusing of single-use plastic and all the amazing advocacy that PPC has inspired and supported around the world is the reason the United Nations recently said there's going to be an international treaty to reduce plastic pollution. So that individual behavior is really important. And I just don't want us to lose sight of how it can reduce our anxiety, how it can call us to service, create that connection that you're talking about that we need so much, Britt and Maya, but also inspire you to create that culture shift we need. So any reaction that you all have to that? And if not, we have other questions here. I think one of the questions about this being a privileged kind of white experience of eco-anxiety, I'd love for you all to comment on that, because that was one of the questions that we've had as well.
Yeah, I had the comments on a couple of those points.
Okay.
The first thing, and I'll be as quick as I can be.
Yeah.
The first thing is that, I'm so glad you brought the point about, the individual carbon footprint and how that was pushed by big oil. The thing about that is that it was a distraction from the real problem. And as long as we're not distracted, I think it's still crucial to, practice whatever our sustainable lifestyle looks like. And the thing is that sustainability and sustainable living looks different for everyone. Sometimes sustainability requires proximity to being able to afford, certain, more like quote unquote eco-friendly products and so on and so forth. But sometimes it really just looks like, doing small things like planting a pollinator garden, on your balcony, or not running the water while you're brushing your teeth, so on and so forth. And so I think that, it is crucial for, our well-being and for culture change. We need to have a culture where sustainability is normalized and is accessible to more people. And that's something that I will never stop pushing for. But as long as we also recognize that, hey, we need systemic change too, and we don't get distracted, away from that, then I think it's fine for people to do what they can and what they feel comfortable with and what's accessible to them. To the question about if this is something that's privileged, it's just something that's being felt by more people. It's something that, Black, Brown, Indigenous communities in the global South have been feeling, even if, as was spoke to earlier, that's not what they call that. I think that, these feelings of anxiety, these feelings of distress, anger, fear that come with, seeing how your community can be ravaged by environmental or climate issues, looking at issues like environmental racism, and then also seeing how there are mental health disparities in a lot of communities of color. All of it directly overlaps. And I think that it's just now being recognized by more people that are not in marginalized communities because of how the climate crisis is intensifying. It's more in the public eye, it's more in the mainstream media. And so it's not like it's one of those issues where we've been feeling it, for a long time. A lot of our communities have been feeling it, and now it's just being felt by more people. So I think it is just still at the end of the day a human issue, and I'm glad that it's being brought to the forefront more slowly. And also another thing to note, just to wrap up about individual action, I come from ancestors that were stewards of the earth, that cherished and, like you said, had a love for the natural world and for the environment that they live in, and knew the practices to be able to reduce, reuse, and to regenerate. And so I think that making individual action like it's just something in vain, or that should just be thrown away because we know we need systemic change as well, is something that's really invalidating to the fact that so many of our ancestors were living sustainably because that was natural and was the norm. And again, it's about going back to that culture shift of making sustainability the norm. So that's my feelings.
I love that. I think that is such a powerful way to frame both of these things of like the false dichotomy of individual action versus policy and market change. We need all of it. And this idea of like, we're naming something that marginalized communities have been experiencing for a very long time. Britt, anything you want to add to that before we dig into other questions? Or is there a question that you've seen that you'd like to just dive in? Because we have about 2 more minutes before Diana wraps up.
Okay, well, I think Maya mentioned the privilege aspects very well. I will just add that additionally, there has been this knee-jerk reaction to say that it is a phenomenon of the white middle class, which is understandable in the sense that the term wasn't around at the popular frenzy that it is now. So it's especially visible, being promoted by certain kinds of people who match that profile. And you might say, well, then why is it just now? And why, if people living close to the land, like Indigenous folks and also communities, Black communities in the US experiencing environmental racism, haven't been calling it that? It's because, the climate crisis isn't the first existential threat, and it comes on top of the legacies of colonization and systemic racism and all other intersecting problems where that's an inadequate term. But many of the feelings and the impacts can be very similar and shared. When we look at our research, we find that the most functional impairment from climate anxiety is indeed in places like India, Philippines, Nigeria, Brazil, low and middle income nations where people of color live. And so anyone can feel eco-anxiety if they understand that their own health is caught up with the health of the environment. And it can be, a tool to dismiss the importance of these feelings by just saying, oh, that's just for the privileged few. Actually, no, we're all on the field, but there are major inequalities here, and perhaps the language isn't adequate.
Thank you, Britt. And I'm seeing we're almost out of time. So what I'd like to do is some great questions that we weren't able to go to. Please follow Britt, Maya, and me on social, reach out. We're happy to talk to you to talk about these specific questions. Just kind of last words, Maya, Britt, and then me, and then we'll turn it over to Deanna, excuse me. Maya, last words, thoughts as we wrap up?
Yeah, I think that, this is a conversation that is also, being brought up because there's been so much more mental health advocacy, that's been brought forth in the recent years. And I think this is something that will ultimately benefit everyone, and hopefully bridge gaps between, mental health disparities and inequity, and also help people know how they can translate, as you say, their anxiety into action and figure out how they can get involved. So
thank you, Britt.
I just wanted to share that there are some questions about coping mechanisms that have come up. This is a big topic. I don't mean to push my book, but I just do want to mention that there are many types of coping mechanisms that are available. I talk about them at length. If people want to dive further into eco-distress, check out the Good Grief Network, check out All We Can Save circles, check out climate cafes, check out activist groups that have an ear towards the emotional elements of doing this work. And there's so much more to put out there. Sorry, I can't answer the question more specifically than that, but my book is going to have some resources for you if you're interested.
And it has great resources. And yes, push the book, push the book.
Okay.
We need to, Britt. That's why we're here. And Maya's also working on a book. Maya, can you tell us just in like 30 seconds about your book?
I actually was going to say very quickly, I am working on a book. I'm still kind of like about to do more information on it publicly. So I don't know.
Sure. Okay, sorry. Okay.
But I do want to say, if your anxiety or any other emotions are really intensive, please speak with a mental health professional or a therapist. Like it's worth it. Some people might feel like, is it really worth to go to a therapist? Yes, it is. If you really feel like it's affecting your daily life, then please do that. And I actually will be sharing some more info and tips around eco-anxiety this week on my Instagram at Maya's Ideas too. So keep an eye out
that as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Maya. Thank you, Britt. I'll just quickly say my book, One Green Thing, was launched last Tuesday, April 19th. And One Green Thing is all about an assessment, kind of like Myers-Briggs or Enneagram, where you can find your strengths and service and apply that to a daily practice. I also have tools, whether it be meditation, whether it be activism, whether it be enlisting people to register to vote, all kinds of ways for you to reduce your anxiety and create that culture shift that we need. Thank you so much, Deanna. Thank you, Britt. Thank you, Maya. Thank you, PPC, and everyone who's joined us.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Britt. Thank you, Maya. And thanks everyone for joining us today. Please save the date for our next webinar. It's going to be on June 22nd. So we're taking the month of May off from our webinar series. So join us on June 22nd for Toxic Tours, virtually experience the impact of plastic production on frontline communities. And if you have, we invite you to join our global coalition. It is free to join us. We welcome everyone, including individuals, businesses, and nonprofits interested in joining our cause for a more just, equitable world free from plastic pollution. We also invite you to connect with us on social media to learn more at Plastic Pollutes and Plastic Pollution Coalition on Facebook. We will also be sending out a link to a survey, and we'd love to get your feedback on today's webinar, which frankly just blew me away and topically is so vital and important. So I really appreciate everyone taking the time to make this webinar happen today and gather together for this discussion. Thanks again to everyone for joining us, to our Plastic Pollution Coalition member groups and partners who shared this webinar with their communities and networks. Thank you. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar on June 22nd. Have a great day.